The Admiral reached slowly for his wallet, making sure every movement was deliberate and visible. Years of experience had taught him these moments required perfect precision, not in the way he commanded ships, but in the delicate dance of surviving an encounter that could turn dangerous in an instant. "Sir, I'm going to reach into my back pocket for my wallet," he announced clearly, using the same calm voice that had guided sailors through storms. The officer's stance grew more rigid, his hand now resting directly on his pepper spray canister. Behind them, more customers had pulled into the gas station, some pretending not to notice the scene unfolding while others openly watched with phones partially raised. As the Admiral retrieved his wallet, a small photo slipped out and fluttered to the ground. A picture of him in full military dress at his daughter's college graduation last spring. The officer's boot stepped on it before he could pick it up, grinding the memory into the oil-stained concrete. "I asked for your license and registration," the officer snapped, ignoring the photo beneath his foot. No sudden movements. His voice carried an edge that seemed to be looking for an excuse, searching for any reason to escalate the situation. "My registration is in the glove compartment," the Admiral explained patiently. "Would you like me to get it now?" He held out his driver's license first, handling it like the sensitive document it had suddenly become. The officer snatched it from his hand, barely glancing at the information before demanding the registration. Inside the gas station store, the cashier had stepped outside, concern evident on her face. She'd worked here for 15 years and knew the Admiral as a regular customer who always greeted her with respect and sometimes brought coffee for the morning staff. Now she watched helplessly as the situation spiraled beyond her control. "Officer," the Admiral said carefully, "I want to be fully transparent with you. I am a high-ranking military officer, and I have documentation to prove that as well." He kept his voice steady, though his heart raced with the familiar surge of adrenaline he'd known in combat, except this battle was happening on home soil, at a simple gas station in Virginia. The officer's face hardened at what he perceived as a challenge to his authority. "Oh, so now you're pulling rank? Get back from the vehicle." His hand moved from the pepper spray to his baton, the metal catching the sunlight in a threatening glint. A small crowd had gathered now, maintaining what they hoped was a safe distance. An older white couple stepped forward, the woman clutching her husband's arm as she said, "Officer, we know this gentleman. He's a regular here and—" "Stay back," the officer barked, cutting her off. "This is a police matter." The couple retreated, but their phones were out now, recording what everyone could sense was about to become much more than a routine traffic stop. The Admiral stood his ground, decades of command experience warring with the survival instincts learned from being a black man in America. "Officer, I'm happy to comply with all lawful requests, but I need to understand the reason for this stop. I've done nothing wrong." Those words seemed to trigger something in the officer. His face flushed red, and his grip tightened on his equipment. The tension in the air grew thick enough to choke on, and time seemed to slow down as the officer took an aggressive step forward. "Last warning," the officer growled, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he already decided how this would end. "Step away from the vehicle and put your hands where I can see them." The Admiral raised his hands slowly, painfully aware that his decades of service, his achievements, and his rank meant nothing in this moment. The gas station security camera whirred silently above, recording what was about to become national news, while the evening sun cast long shadows that seemed to point toward an unavoidable confrontation. Time seemed to freeze in the warm evening air as the Admiral stood with his hands raised, his military ID still tucked in his pocket, unused and unseen. The security cameras kept rolling, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold at this ordinary gas station on what should have been just another Sunday evening. "I'm going to reach for my military identification," the Admiral said calmly, his voice carrying the steady authority of someone who had faced far worse situations. But before he could move, the officer's hand shot to his belt. Without warning or provocation, the officer raised the pepper spray canister. There was no countdown, no final warning, just the sudden hiss of the spray cutting through the air. The burning mist hit the Admiral directly in the face, and decades of military training couldn't prepare him for the searing pain that followed. The Admiral dropped to his knees, his hands instinctively moving to protect his face. The pain was excruciating, like someone had poured liquid fire into his eyes. Around him, gasps and shouts erupted from the growing crowd. The young cashier screamed, "Stop!" from the doorway, her voice cracking with emotion. "Don't move. Stay down," the officer shouted, though the Admiral was already on the ground, struggling to breathe through the burning sensation that seemed to coat his entire face. The rough asphalt pressed against his knees as he tried to maintain his dignity even in this moment of humiliation. The elderly couple who had tried to intervene earlier were now frantically dialing 911, their shaking hands struggling with their phones. "We need help." The woman's voice trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher. "An officer is assaulting a military officer. Please, send someone quickly." Through the burning haze, the Admiral felt cold metal close around his wrists. The handcuffs clicked shut with a finality that echoed across the parking lot. His pressed polo shirt, the one he'd worn to lunch with his fellow officers just hours ago, scraped against the rough pavement. "Listen to me," the Admiral managed to say between gasps, his voice hoarse from the spray. "In my right pocket, my military ID. I'm a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy." But his words were drowned out by the officer's radio crackling to life as he called for backup, describing a resistant suspect at the gas station. More phones had appeared in the crowd, recording everything. A mother pulled her young son close, covering his eyes but unable to look away herself. The boy would later ask why the man in the nice shirt was crying, and she would struggle to explain what she herself couldn't understand. The burning wouldn't stop. The Admiral's eyes felt like they were on fire, tears streaming down his face as his body tried desperately to flush out the pepper spray. Years of combat training had taught him how to handle tear gas, but this was different. This was personal, up close, and on American soil. Through the chaos, one bystander had the presence of mind to retrieve the fallen military photo from under the officer's boot. It was crumpled now, but the image was clear. The Admiral in his full-dress uniform, decorated with medals earned protecting the very freedoms being denied to him in this moment. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as backup units raced to the scene. The Admiral remained on his knees, handcuffed and in pain, but still carrying himself with the dignity of his rank. His thoughts weren't on his own suffering, but on what this moment would mean for his fellow officers, for his community, and for the country he had served faithfully for over 3 decades. As the red and blue lights began to flash across the gas station's windows, reflecting off the spilled drops of pepper spray on the ground, everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would reach far beyond this small corner of Virginia. The truth of what happened here would soon echo through the halls of the Pentagon, across social media, and into the national consciousness. Inside the police station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the Admiral sat handcuffed to a metal chair, his eyes still red and swollen from the pepper spray. His once crisp polo shirt was dirty from the pavement, but his posture remained straight, maintaining the bearing that 3 decades of naval service had instilled in him. 2 desk officers whispered to each other, stealing glances at their unusual prisoner. Something about him didn't fit their usual profile. His calm demeanor, his precise speech, the way he held himself even while restrained. On the desk between them lay his wallet and phone, still unopened, still unchecked. The precinct captain walked in, his shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. He was carrying a laptop, likely having just watched the gas station's security footage that was already spreading across social media. His face showed the first signs of realizing something had gone terribly wrong. "Sir," the Admiral spoke clearly, despite his irritated throat. "If you'll check my right pocket, you'll find my military identification. I've been trying to show it since this began." His voice carried no anger, just the steady authority of someone used to being heard. The captain nodded to one of the officers, who carefully reached into the Admiral's pocket. The moment the officer pulled out the military ID, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. The officer's hand began to shake as he read the credentials, and the color drained from his face. "Dear God," the captain whispered, taking the ID himself. He read it once, twice, then looked at the Admiral with new eyes. Before him sat not just any military officer, but a rear admiral, a man who commanded entire fleets, who had served in multiple war zones, who had earned some of the highest honors the nation could bestow. The nearby dispatcher, who had been half listening while handling other calls, dropped her coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. The spreading coffee created a dark stain on the floor, much like the stain this incident would leave on the department's reputation. "Remove those handcuffs. Now," the captain ordered, his voice cracking with urgency. The desk officer fumbled with the keys, hands trembling as he unlocked the restraints. The metal cuffs had left red marks on the Admiral's wrists, a temporary physical reminder of a permanent psychological wound. As if on cue, phones throughout the precinct began ringing. The incident videos were going viral. The front desk was fielding calls from reporters, civil rights organizations, and the Navy's Judge Advocate General's office. In the background, a TV mounted on the wall showed the first breaking news banner. U.S. Navy Admiral Pepper sprayed and arrested at gas station. "Sir, the captain started, then stopped, realizing no words could adequately address what had happened. He watched as the Admiral slowly rubbed his wrists, those hands that had once guided ships through hostile waters now bearing the marks of injustice on home soil. A young officer rushed in with a first aid kit and some eye wash, but it was hours too late. The damage, both physical and institutional, was already done. Through the station's windows, camera flashes could be seen as reporters began gathering outside. Someone had leaked the Admiral's identity to the press. The Admiral finally stood up, his full height and bearing now evident to everyone in the room. Despite everything he'd endured, his voice remained steady as he said, "I'll need to make some calls. The Navy will want a full report of this incident." It wasn't a threat. It was simply a fact, delivered with the same calm precision he used to direct a fleet maneuver. As department phones kept ringing and officers scrambled to respond to the growing media presence outside, everyone in that room knew they were witnessing the beginning of something much bigger than a simple case of mistaken identity. This was about to become a moment that would force America to once again confront some hard truths about power, prejudice, and the price of wearing a uniform, any uniform, in modern America. By sunrise the next morning, the story had exploded across the nation. The gas station security footage played on every major news channel, while cell phone videos from bystanders flooded social media. Each new angle showed the same disturbing scene: a respected naval officer, in casual clothes, being pepper sprayed while trying to identify himself. In the Pentagon's massive corridors, high-ranking officers gathered in emergency meetings. The Chief of Naval Operations himself sat at the head of a polished conference table, watching the footage for the third time that morning. Around him, admirals and generals sat in stunned silence, many of them personal friends of their fellow officer who had been assaulted. "I served with him in the Pacific," one senior officer spoke up, his voice tight with emotion. "He commanded a carrier group during 2 major operations, and this is how he's treated at home." The room filled with murmurs of agreement and barely contained anger. Outside the police station, protesters began gathering. They carried signs reading, "Protect our protectors," and "No one is safe." Veterans in their service caps stood shoulder to shoulder with civil rights activists. A group of retired naval officers arrived in full dress uniform, standing at attention in silent protest. The story took another turn when someone leaked the Admiral's service record. News anchors read out his achievements with barely concealed amazement: multiple combat deployments, 2 Purple Hearts, leadership of international military operations, and a key role in humanitarian missions across the globe. The contrast between his service and his treatment at the gas station couldn't have been starker. Inside his home, the Admiral sat with his family, watching the coverage with mixed emotions. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident. Calls came in from fellow officers, civil rights attorneys, and even the Secretary of the Navy. His wife held his hand tightly as they watched their private life become a national talking point. "Dad," his teenage son said, looking up from his phone, "your video has 10 million views." The Admiral just nodded, more concerned about what this meant for other service members who might face similar situations, especially those without the protection of rank and recognition. The Navy's Judge Advocate General's office launched an immediate investigation. They gathered statements from witnesses at the gas station, including the elderly couple who had tried to intervene and the young cashier who had known the Admiral as a regular customer. Each account added another layer to the story of injustice. Local veterans groups organized a support rally near the gas station. They came from all branches of service: Army, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, standing united behind their naval brother. Many brought their families, wanting their children to witness this moment of solidarity. In Washington, D.C., civil rights leaders held press conferences demanding action. They pointed out how this incident proved that even the highest achievements and service to country provided no shield against racial profiling. If a Navy admiral could be treated this way, they asked, what hope did ordinary citizens have? The police department faced mounting pressure from all sides. Their phones rang constantly with media inquiries and angry citizens. Internal Affairs investigators arrived to begin their review, their faces grim as they requested personnel files and body camera footage. The officer who had used the pepper spray was placed on immediate administrative leave, but everyone knew this was just the beginning. As the sun set on that second day, the Admiral received an unexpected call. It was from a group of police academy cadets, asking if he would be willing to speak to their class about his experience. They wanted to learn from this incident, to understand how to prevent it from happening again. Despite everything, the Admiral agreed without hesitation. If his experience could help create change, he was willing to share it. The incident had become more than just another viral video. It was now a national conversation about service, respect, and the work still needed to bridge America's deepest divides. The Internal Affairs Office buzzed with activity as investigators pored over years of records. Computer screens glowed late into the night, displaying complaint reports, incident files, and performance reviews. What they found painted a disturbing picture of the officer who had pepper sprayed the Admiral. "Look at this," one investigator said to her colleague, pointing at her screen. 3 complaints of excessive force in the past year alone. She scrolled through the documents, each one showing a similar pattern. The complaints had been filed, reviewed, and somehow deemed unsubstantiated despite clear evidence. The body camera footage from the gas station incident proved especially damaging. While the officer claimed in his report that the Admiral had made threatening movements, the video showed something entirely different. It captured a calm, professional man trying to identify himself while being met with increasing aggression. In a conference room down the hall, 2 senior investigators interviewed the gas station employees. The young cashier wiped tears from her eyes as she described how the Admiral had always been kind to the staff, remembering their names and asking about their families. "He even helped us change a flat tire once," she said, her voice shaking. "And they treated him like a criminal." The elderly couple who witnessed the incident also came forward with their statement. "We tried to tell the officer who he was," the woman explained, clutching her husband's hand. "But he wouldn't listen. He didn't want to listen. You could see it in his eyes. He already decided what was going to happen." As investigators dug deeper, they discovered more troubling facts. The officer's social media history revealed posts that showed clear bias. His patrol patterns indicated he disproportionately stopped minority drivers. Fellow officers, speaking anonymously, described his aggressive approach to even routine interactions with people of color. The police chief faced tough questions during a press conference. Reporters demanded to know how these patterns had been missed or ignored. The chief, sweating under the bright lights, struggled to explain the department's oversight failures. "We are conducting a thorough review of all our procedures," he repeated, but his words rang hollow. Training records show the officer had attended required diversity courses, but notes from instructors indicated he had been dismissive and unengaged. One instructor had even recommended additional training, but the recommendation had been buried in paperwork and never followed up. In a small office near the back of the building, a veteran internal affairs officer shook his head as he reviewed the growing file. "This isn't just about one incident," he told his team. "This is about a system that allowed these behaviors to continue unchecked. We failed our community." The investigation expanded to include the supervisor who had dismissed previous complaints. Files showed a pattern of quick dismissals, often without proper investigation. When questioned, the supervisor claimed he was following standard procedures, but couldn't explain why video evidence had been ignored. Local community leaders were invited to review the findings. They sat in stunned silence as investigators presented the timeline of missed opportunities and ignored warnings. One pastor, who had been working on police relations for decades, simply whispered, "How many others didn't have a high rank to protect them?" The department's training division came under scrutiny too. Their methods for handling bias complaints were outdated, their follow-up procedures inadequate. The trainers themselves admitted they felt powerless to flag problem officers once they left the academy. As the investigation neared its end, the evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just about one officer's actions on one Sunday evening. It was about a culture that had allowed prejudice to hide behind a badge, about systems that had failed both the community and the good officers who served it honorably. The final report would lead to more than just one officer's termination. It would force the entire department to confront uncomfortable truths about power, accountability, and the true meaning of protecting and serving all members of their community. The city council chamber was packed to capacity on the day of the final hearing. The officer who had pepper sprayed the Admiral sat at a table facing the review board, his police uniform replaced by a gray suit that seemed to hang loosely on his shoulders. The weight of his actions had taken a visible toll. Behind him, rows of citizens, activists, and fellow officers filled every seat. The Admiral sat quietly in the front row, surrounded by his family and naval colleagues. He had chosen to attend not out of anger or desire for revenge, but because he believed this moment mattered for the future of his community. Based on the evidence presented, the board chairman began, his voice echoing through the hushed room. "We find the officer's actions were not only unjustified, but demonstrated clear racial bias and excessive use of force." The words fell heavy in the silent chamber. The officer's termination was immediate and permanent. His police certification would be revoked, preventing him from serving in law enforcement anywhere in the country. But the consequences didn't stop there. The district attorney announced criminal charges for assault and civil rights violations, marking a rare instance of an officer facing prosecution for on-duty conduct. Outside the chamber, reporters thrust microphones toward the Admiral, asking how he felt about the decision. His response surprised many. "This isn't about punishment," he said thoughtfully. "It's about change. Real, lasting change that ensures this doesn't happen to anyone else, with or without stars on their shoulders." The police department underwent a complete overhaul of its training and oversight procedures. Every officer would now wear body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters. Bias complaint investigations would be handled by an independent civilian review board. The changes were sweeping and substantial. The city also faced civil litigation. Rather than fight it, city leaders chose to settle quickly and publicly. But the Admiral had an unusual request. He wanted the settlement money to fund police reform programs and community outreach initiatives. "Let's turn this moment into momentum," he told the city council. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Officers from the department began reaching out to the Admiral, asking to share their own stories of witnessing bias and feeling helpless to stop it. They wanted guidance on how to create change from within the system. The Admiral listened to them all. In his home office, surrounded by photos from his naval career, he took notes during these conversations. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of how to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Even the officer's former partner came forward, tears in his eyes as he admitted he should have spoken up sooner about the warning signs he'd seen. "I was afraid of being labeled a troublemaker," he confessed, "but my silence made me part of the problem." The local police academy invited the Admiral to help reshape their training program. They wanted future officers to understand that true authority comes from respect, not fear. The Admiral stood before the cadets, sharing not just his experience at the gas station, but his decades of leadership lessons from the Navy. Veterans groups and civil rights organizations, which had often worked separately, began collaborating on community programs. They organized meetings between police officers and local residents, creating spaces for honest dialogue about fear, respect, and responsibility. The officer who had wielded the pepper spray eventually issued a public apology. It wasn't just a prepared statement. It was a raw, honest acknowledgement of his biases and mistakes. He asked to meet with the Admiral privately, not seeking forgiveness, but understanding. Through it all, the Admiral maintained his dignity and sense of purpose. He knew that real change wouldn't come from anger or revenge, but from turning this painful moment into an opportunity for growth and understanding. His response to injustice would become a template for others facing similar situations. 6 months after the gas station incident, the Admiral stood at a podium in a community center packed with people from all walks of life. Behind him hung a banner reading "Building Bridges, Police and Community Unity Foundation." This was the official launch of his new organization, born from an incident of injustice, but focused on creating positive change. "When I was pepper sprayed that day," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I could have chosen anger. I could have chosen bitterness. Instead, I chose to build something new." The audience, a mix of police officers, community members, and fellow veterans, listened intently. The Foundation's first project was already underway. A mentorship program pairing experienced officers with community youth. In the back of the room, a young police officer sat with a group of teenagers, discussing their experiences and fears. The teenagers spoke openly about their distrust of law enforcement, while the officer shared his own struggles to build trust. Local businesses had stepped up to support the initiative. The same gas station where the incident occurred now served as a monthly meeting spot for community police dialogue sessions. The young cashier who had witnessed the pepper spray incident helped organize these meetings, turning a place of trauma into one of healing. The Admiral's approach was unique. He brought military leadership principles to police training, emphasizing discipline, respect, and the true meaning of service. In the Navy, he explained to a group of officers, "We learned that real authority comes from earning trust, not demanding it." The Foundation created a scholarship program for minority students interested in law enforcement careers. "We need officers who understand our communities," the Admiral told reporters. "We need to build a force that reflects the people it serves." The first round of scholarships had already been awarded to 10 promising students. In police academies across the state, training methods were changing. The Admiral worked with instructors to develop new scenarios based on real incidents, including his own. Cadets learned not just about law enforcement techniques, but about the communities they would serve and the impact of their actions. The Foundation's work caught national attention. Other cities began requesting guidance on implementing similar programs. The Admiral traveled across the country, sharing his story and his vision for change. But he always emphasized that the real work happened at the local level, in daily interactions between officers and citizens. One particularly moving moment came when the Admiral visited a high school in a low-income neighborhood. A student asked him how he could trust police after what happened. The Admiral thought carefully before answering, trust isn't given or taken. It's built, one interaction at a time. That's why we're here. The foundation also focused on supporting good officers. They created a program recognizing police officers who showed exceptional community engagement. These officers became mentors to newer recruits, helping to shape a new generation of law enforcement. Veterans played a crucial role in the Foundation's work. They shared their experiences of serving abroad and returning home to face discrimination. Their stories helped officers understand the complexity of wearing a uniform while still facing prejudice. The Admiral's wife became involved, too, working with police families to help them understand the pressures their loved ones faced and the importance of addressing bias at home. Change doesn't just happen at work, she would say. It happens around dinner tables and in living rooms. As the Foundation grew, something remarkable happened. Officers began reporting increased job satisfaction. Community complaints decreased. Young people started seeing law enforcement as a potential career rather than a threat. The transformation wasn't perfect or complete, but it was real and growing. Standing in that community center, looking out at faces full of hope and determination, the Admiral saw something powerful. A community coming together to turn a moment of darkness into a movement for change. His personal ordeal had become a catalyst for transformation, proving that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best opportunities for progress. 1 year after the pepper spray incident, the Admiral stood once again at the gas station where it all began. The place looked different now. A small plaque had been installed, not to commemorate the incident, but to celebrate the changes that followed. Site of the first Community Police Unity meeting. It read, "The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as police cadets gathered for a special training session. These weren't the same concrete slabs where the Admiral had once been forced to his knees. They were now the foundation for building something better. Inside the station's newly expanded convenience store, the walls displayed photographs of community events. The young cashier, now promoted to manager, had created a wall of unity, showing officers and residents working together at various Foundation projects. The image of the Admiral in his dress uniform stood at the center, surrounded by pictures of positive change. The officer who had used the pepper spray that day was serving his sentence, but something unexpected had happened. He had written a detailed account of his journey from bias to understanding, which was now required reading in police academies across the country. His story wasn't celebrated, but it was used to teach others about the consequences of unchecked prejudice. Local crime statistics told a powerful story. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%. Community trust ratings had soared. More importantly, residents reported feeling safer approaching officers with concerns. The fear that had once divided the community was slowly being replaced by dialogue. The Admiral's Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started in one city had spread to 50 others, each adapting the program to their local needs. Police departments nationwide were sending representatives to learn about the training methods that had proven so successful. In a touching turn of events, several of the bystanders who had recorded the original incident were now regular volunteers at Foundation events. The elderly couple who had tried to intervene that day now led a senior citizens advisory board, helping police better understand and serve older residents. The Admiral's son, inspired by the changes he'd witnessed, decided to pursue a career in law enforcement himself. "I want to be part of this new generation," he told his father. "I want to show that the uniform can stand for protection and respect, not fear and power." The case had become required studying material at law schools and police academies. Students analyzed not just what went wrong, but how the response to it created positive change. The Admiral's choice to transform trauma into progress became a model for handling similar incidents. At police graduations across the country, new officers now took an additional oath, one written by the Admiral himself. It spoke not just of protecting and serving, but of understanding, respecting, and truly connecting with the communities they would serve. The gas station's security camera footage, which had once shown a moment of injustice, was now followed by a year's worth of positive interactions captured at the same spot. Officers stopping by for coffee and conversation. Community meetings in the parking lot. Children high-fiving police officers during neighborhood events. Other military leaders followed the Admiral's example, stepping forward to bridge gaps between law enforcement and their communities. A network of veterans emerged, dedicated to using their leadership experience to promote understanding and prevent similar incidents. The Admiral's personal files from that day, his military ID, the crumpled photo from under the officer's boot, were donated to a civil rights museum. But they weren't displayed alone. Alongside them stood evidence of change, training manuals, community program guides, and letters from officers and citizens whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. Standing there at the gas station 1 year later, the Admiral watched as police recruits and community members arrived for another training session. His uniform that day wasn't his naval dress whites or even the polo shirt from that fateful Sunday. It was a simple shirt with his Foundation's logo, a badge and an olive branch intertwined. The message was clear: peace and protection could, and should, work together.